You've probably heard that the pyramids were built by slaves, that a deadly curse protected King Tut's tomb, and that a giant statue once straddled an entire harbour. But what if I told you all of that is wrong? The real story is way more surprising. In this video, we're digging into the truth behind 10 of the biggest myths from the ancient world and setting the record straight. Let's get into it. History is a story, and like any good story, it gets a little more dramatic each time it's told. Thanks to everything from Hollywood blockbusters to our old school textbooks, we've all picked up a version of the past that's full of some pretty wild and often totally misleading tales. These myths are so common that we just accept them as fact. But once you peel back the layers of drama and time, you find that the real history is way more complex and interesting than the legends we've been fed. We're going to check out the archaeological evidence, go back to the original sources and separate the facts from the fiction. Get ready to have your view of the ancient world turned upside down. Myth number 10. The pyramids were built by slaves. Let's kick things off with a huge one. The idea that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built by thousands of slaves suffering under the Egyptian sun. This image, made famous by the Greek historian Herodotus and cemented in our minds by movies like The Ten Commandments, is hard to shake. We picture miserable people captured in wars, hauling massive stones under the crack of a whip. It's a story of incredible cruelty that has defined how we see ancient Egypt for centuries, but the archaeology tells a completely different story. Back in the 1990s, excavators uncovered a lost city right next to the pyramids, which housed the very people who built these tombs. And guess what? They weren't slaves at all. They were skilled, paid workers. These were respected builders and artisans, organized into super efficient crews. Archaeologists even found their tombs, located respectfully near the pharaoh's pyramids they served. Inside, they found the remains of well-fed people. Looking at their bones, scientists learned they ate prime beef, a real luxury back then, and were given daily rations of bread and beer. The workforce was a mix of full-time skilled craftsmen and seasonal farmers. During the months when the Nile River flooded their fields, thousands of farmers would head to Giza to work on the pyramids. This wasn't forced labor, it was more like a national project. It was a way for them to pay their taxes and be part of something with huge religious and cultural importance. They were given housing, food, and even medical care. Finding their settlement, with its own bakeries, breweries, and clinics, paints a picture of a well-organized, state-funded project. Way more like a modern construction site than a slave camp. And the idea that enslaved Israelites built the pyramids? Also a myth. There's no evidence they were even in Egypt when the Great Pyramids were built. The pyramids were built by Egyptians for Egyptians, a massive testament to their skill, devotion, and incredible planning. Myth number 9, the curse of King Tut's tomb. In 1922, when Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon broke into Tutankhamun's tomb, they didn't just find treasure, they unleashed a legend, the Curse of the Pharaohs. The story goes that an inscription on the tomb promised a swift death to anyone who disturbed the boy king's sleep. And when a few people from the excavation team died mysteriously, the 1920s media had a field day. It all started with Lord Carnarvon himself, who died from an infected mosquito bite just a few months after entering the tomb. Newspapers, loving a sensational story, linked his death to the curse, and a global myth was born. But here's the thing, there was no curse. Not in the way the story is told anyway. No one ever found any hieroglyphs in Tut's tomb that warned of death for those who entered. While some tombs did have general protective spells, the whole dramatic Hollywood-style curse was a complete invention. It was pure media hype, feeding the public's obsession with all things exotic and spooky. The idea of an ancient mystical power striking down modern-day intruders was just too good of a story to check. So what about all the deaths? Just a spooky coincidence? Pretty much, yeah. A study looked at the survival rates of the 44 Westerners who were there when the tomb was opened. It found that, on average, they lived just as long as other people from that time. In fact, Howard Carter, the guy who led the whole thing and was the very first to step inside the burial chamber, lived for another 17 years and died at 64. Most of the other victims lived long lives and died of normal, explainable causes. Lord Carnarvon's death, while tragically timed, was from a simple infection that could easily turn deadly before antibiotics existed. The myth of King Tut's curse is just a powerful example of how a good story, even a fake one, can take on a life of its own. Myth number 8. 300 Spartans alone held Thermopylae. The story is iconic thanks to comics and movies, 300 Spartans standing alone against a million-man Persian army at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. It's the ultimate underdog story. King Leonidas and his 300 bodyguards held the line for days, taking down wave after wave of invaders before being heroically wiped out. It's become a symbol of fighting to the last man against impossible odds. The only problem is that's not the whole story. While the 300 Spartans were definitely at the center of the battle, they were far from alone. King Leonidas was actually leading an army of about 7,000 Greek soldiers. This force included troops from all over Greece, including 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans, who fought right alongside the Spartans. For 2 days, this combined Greek army managed to hold off the massive Persian force. And about that Persian army, while it was huge, the 1 million men number from ancient historians like Herodotus is probably an exaggeration. Modern historians, thinking about the logistics of feeding and watering that many people, estimate Xerxes' army was more likely somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000. Still, the Greeks were massively outnumbered. The most famous part of the battle, the last stand, happened after a local betrayed the Greeks by showing the Persians a hidden path to surround them. Realizing they were trapped, Leonidas sent most of the army away to save them. He and his 300 Spartans stayed, but they weren't alone. The 700 Thespians chose to stay with them and fight to the death. The Thebans also stayed, though some sources say they surrendered. The sacrifice at Thermopylae was absolutely heroic, but it was a group effort. The myth of the 300 erases the thousands of other Greeks who fought, and in the case of the Thespians, died right there with the Spartans. Myth number 7. The Minoan civilization was destroyed by the Thera eruption. Sometime in the 1600s, BCE, one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history happened on the island of Santorini, then called Thera. The explosion was so huge it literally blew the island apart, burying the city of Akrotiri in ash and preserving it like a Bronze Age Pompeii. For a long time, everyone thought this single catastrophe was what wiped out the advanced Minoan civilization on the nearby island of Crete. It seemed like the perfect explanation, and it even got people wondering if the Minoans were the real-life Atlantis. But careful archaeological work on Crete shows a much more complicated story. The Thera eruption was definitely a huge blow. It caused earthquakes and giant tsunamis that would have slammed the northern coast of Crete, and falling ash would have ruined crops. But it wasn't the end for the Minoans. Not even close. Evidence from all over Crete shows that Minoan culture didn't just survive, it continued to thrive for several more centuries. Palaces were rebuilt, trade routes were fired back up, and their unique art and culture kept evolving. In fact, the period right after the eruption is considered a high point for Minoan influence. The real downfall of the Minoan civilization was a slow, gradual process that took generations. It was probably a mix of things: long-term economic problems after the eruption, internal political conflicts, and the growing power of the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, who eventually took over the region. The idea of one giant disaster wiping out an entire civilization is exciting, but the reality is a slower story of resilience, adaptation, and eventual decline. The Thera eruption was a huge event in the Minoan story, but it wasn't the last page. Myth number 6. The Romans sowed salt on Carthage. The story is the ultimate symbol of total victory. After 100 years of war, Rome finally defeated its arch-rival Carthage in 146 BCE. Roman soldiers not only burned the city to the ground and sold the survivors into slavery, but, as a final curse, they ploughed the fields and sowed them with salt, making sure nothing would ever grow there again. This act has become a metaphor for complete destruction, a tale of Roman ruthlessness. But for all its drama, there's zero evidence it ever happened. The story is a total myth that seems to have been invented much, much later. If you look at the ancient historians who actually wrote about the fall of Carthage, none of them mention salt. Polybius, who was an eyewitness to the city's destruction, gives a detailed account but says nothing about salting the earth. Appian, another major historian of the Punic Wars, also leaves out this detail. The idea just doesn't show up in any Roman text. On top of that, the archaeology backs this up. Soil samples from the area around ancient Carthage show no signs of super high salt levels. In fact, just a century later, the Romans themselves built a brand new, thriving city right on top of the old one, something they probably wouldn't have done if the land was cursed and barren. The story about salting the earth seems to be a 19th century invention that was just so dramatic, people assumed it was true. The Romans were definitely brutal to Carthage, but this one symbolic act of eternal damnation is pure legend. Myth number 5. Julius Caesar was born by caesarean section. It seems pretty obvious, right? Julius Caesar was born by caesarean section, and that's where the procedure got its name. The connection feels so direct that it's been accepted as fact for centuries. The story suggests a dramatic, life-saving surgery in ancient Rome that brought a historical giant into the world and named the procedure in the process. Except this is impossible for one very simple reason. Julius Caesar's mother, Aurelia, lived a long and healthy life. She was a major influence on her son's career and didn't die until he was 45. Back in ancient Rome, the surgery we call a C-section was an absolute last resort, performed only on a mother who was already dead or dying, just to try and save the baby. It was not something the mother survived. The first successful C-section where both mother and baby survived wouldn't happen for another 1,900 years. Since Aurelia lived for decades after giving birth, there's no way her son was born by C-section. So where does the name come from? The most likely story is that the family name Caesar comes from the Latin verb caedere, which means to cut. This would mean one of Caesar's ancestors, not Caesar himself, was born this way after his mother had died. Another theory is that an ancestor was born with a full head of hair, which comes from the Latin word Caesaris. Whatever the real origin is, we know for sure it wasn't Julius Caesar. His family name gave its name to the procedure, not the other way around. Myth number 4. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. It's the ultimate image of a terrible, uncaring ruler. In the year 64 CE, as a massive fire destroyed Rome, the Emperor Nero supposedly climbed a tower, put on a costume, and played his instrument while singing about the destruction. This one story has basically defined Nero's entire legacy, painting him as a monster who might have even started the fire himself, just to clear land for a new palace. But the story is full of holes. First off, the most obvious one. The fiddle wasn't even invented for another 1,000 years. If he played anything, it would have been a lyre, which is a small harp. But did he even do that? The most reliable historian from the time, Tacitus, who was actually a kid in Rome during the fire, tells a totally different story. According to him, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was 35 miles away at his villa. When he got the news, he rushed back to the city and immediately started organising relief efforts. He opened his own palaces to house the homeless and worked to get food supplies to the people. The stories about Nero singing while the city burned come from less reliable sources who were writing decades or even centuries later and had an axe to grind. The image of him fiddling was almost certainly political propaganda spread by his enemies to make him look insane. Now, Nero was definitely a brutal tyrant in many ways, and he did take advantage of the cleared land to build his massive golden house. But the specific story of him callously playing music while his city burned is fiction. He did, however, need someone to blame, and he chose the city's small Christian community, kicking off the first major Roman persecution against them. Myth number 3. Christians were fed to lions in the Colosseum under Nero. Speaking of Emperor Nero, another gruesome image we have is of him throwing Christians to the lions in the Colosseum as punishment for the Great Fire of Rome. This scene is in tons of paintings and movies, and it's become the defining image of early Christian martyrdom. But it couldn't have happened under Nero for one very simple reason. The Colosseum hadn't been built yet. Construction on the Colosseum, officially called the Flavian Amphitheatre, didn't start until 72 CE and was finished in 80 CE. Nero died in 68 CE, 4 years before the first stone was laid. The giant arena we associate with gladiators and public executions was a project of the next dynasty of emperors. Now, this doesn't mean Nero didn't persecute Christians. He absolutely did, and it was horrific. The historian Tacitus describes in grim detail how Nero blamed them for the fire and had them torn apart by dogs, nailed to crosses, or covered in pitch and set on fire to be used as human torches in his gardens at night. These atrocities were real, but they happened in his own circus and gardens, not in the Colosseum. The myth probably comes from mixing up Nero's very real cruelty with the Colosseum's later use for public executions, which sometimes did include death by wild animals. So while Christians were martyred in arenas across the empire for centuries, the story of Nero feeding them to lions in the Colosseum is a historical impossibility. Myth number 2. Ancient Greek statues were plain white marble. When we think of classical art, we picture those beautiful, pure white marble statues. From the sculptures of the Parthenon to the Venus de Milo, these works have defined beauty for centuries. Renaissance artists were so inspired by this look that they thought the Greeks and Romans rejected colour for pure form. This idea of classical whiteness became a symbol of high-minded, rational civilization. But that's just an accident of time. The truth is, the ancient world was incredibly colourful. Those white statues were originally painted from head to toe in bright, vibrant, and what we might even call gaudy colours. The practice is called polychromy. Over hundreds of years of being buried or exposed to the weather, all that paint faded away, leaving behind the bare stone we see today. In some cases, aggressive cleaning centuries ago removed the last tiny traces of colour. For decades, scientists have been using cool tech like UV and infrared light to find and analyse the microscopic flecks of paint still clinging to these statues. And what they're finding is stunning. Hair was painted brown and yellow, eyes were coloured in, and clothes were decorated with bright, intricate patterns. Reds, blues and greens were everywhere, and details were often picked out in gold leaf. Modern reconstructions show statues that look shockingly lifelike and anything but plain. That pristine white marble we love in museums is actually an unfinished product in the eyes of an ancient Greek. Their world was in full colour, and so was their art. Myth number 1. The Aztecs mistook Cortés for a god. This might be the most stubborn myth about the Americas. The story goes that when the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, the Aztec emperor Moctezuma II thought he was a returning god Quetzalcoatl. According to legend, a prophecy said this light-skinned, bearded god would return from the east in that exact year. So Moctezuma, frozen by religious awe, supposedly welcomed the invaders and just handed over his empire. For centuries, this story has been used to explain how a few hundred Spaniards took down the massive Aztec empire. It makes the Aztecs seem naive and superstitious, and the Spanish victory seem inevitable. The reality? This story was made up after the conquest, probably by the Spanish themselves, to justify what they did and make themselves look even more impressive. There are no reliable Aztec sources from that time that say anyone thought Cortés was a god. The story first shows up in the writings of Spanish chroniclers, especially one who wrote his account decades later and had never even been to the Americas. It was later mixed into indigenous accounts that were influenced by the Spanish, but you don't find it in the earliest, most authentic Aztec records. What the Aztec sources actually show is a lot of confusion, curiosity and fear about these newcomers. They were definitely blown away by Spanish technology, the ships, the guns, the horses, but they saw them as powerful and dangerous human invaders, not gods. Moctezuma's plan was all about cautious diplomacy and strategy, not blind worship. He sent messengers, offered gifts, and tried to figure out what these strangers wanted. He was a practical leader facing a totally new kind of threat. The Aztec Empire really fell because of superior Spanish weapons, devastating diseases like smallpox, and, most importantly, the alliances Cortés made with other indigenous groups who hated the Aztecs and wanted to see them fall. The myth of the returning god is a convenient story that covers up the complex and brutal reality of the conquest. Conclusion. So, from the paid builders of Giza to the colourful statues of Athens, it's pretty clear the ancient world wasn't quite the place we imagine. The truth buried under all these myths is often way more fascinating than the fiction. We've busted 10 big myths today, but there are so many more out there. History is always changing as new discoveries challenge what we think we know. Questioning these stories isn't just about being a know-it-all, it's about getting a more honest picture of the people who came before us and seeing them as complex humans, just like us. What other ancient history myths have you heard? Which one that we busted today surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I really do read them. And if you had fun uncovering the truth, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.